Throughout the centuries, the Tower of London has become a place synonymous with torture and execution. It was where 3 queens would lose their heads in the most brutal and barbaric ways on a wooden scaffold in front of a group of gathered witnesses. Henry VIII sent 2 of his wives to their deaths this way, and Mary I also condemned the 9-day queen. But the Tower was reserved mostly for private executions, and it was somewhere high-profile people paid the ultimate price for their crimes. In this history documentary, we look at 5 Tower of London executions, and we assess who had the worst and most barbaric end and demise within the infamous fortress on the banks of the River Thames. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Queen Anne Boleyn was the second wife of Henry VIII, and she is best remembered for being the executed wife who lost her head within the walls of the Tower of London. She was a prisoner of the former place where she awaited for her coronation as queen, but she had been the victim of the schemes of Henry VIII and his chief minister Thomas Cromwell. Anne was accused of treason, adultery and incest. However, it's known obviously that her cause of death was beheading by sword. The sword of the French executioner came crashing onto her neck. But there was much more to her execution than just this, as her real cause of death was the lies of the other men that collaborated to bring down her downfall to allow the king to marry his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. In this video, we look at the specific execution blow to Anne Boleyn and what the effects of this would be, as her body was later discovered under the floors of the chapel, St. Peter ad Vincula, where she was buried following the swing of the sword. What is the post-mortem of Anne Boleyn? Anne Boleyn as a queen was shrouded in great controversy throughout her entire reign as the Queen of England. Many women hated her across the nation, and they regarded her as a homewrecker who destroyed Henry's marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The king tried everything that he could think of to get rid of his first wife, but he eventually declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and he then led a number of hugely sweeping changes with the church that led to the monasteries being closed and religious houses and their wealth being absorbed into the coffers of the royal family. But Anne, during her married years, did give birth to the greatest Tudor monarch of all, Elizabeth I, but her failure to provide the king with a male heir also led to her great fall. This was one of the biggest causes of her downfall. After a number of miscarriages, the king looked elsewhere, and specifically towards Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Henry VIII had grown very tired of Anne, and Jane was seen as the woman who could give the king his heir. But to get rid of Anne, the king ordered Thomas Cromwell to come up with a number of false charges and false pieces of evidence that could see her accused of a number of crimes. One thing to consider is that at the time there had never been a noblewoman executed, so when Henry VIII would do what he'd do would be earth-shattering, ordering the execution of his wife. Anne herself had many enemies at court, and she would never have believed that her husband would turn against her. But alongside her were 5 other men, including her own brother, who were accused of adultery. But these men were executed following their trial, with the axe smashing down on their necks upon Tower Hill. One of these men, a musician inside of the court, was tortured, and he confessed. On the 15th of May 1536, Anne Boleyn, who had been held inside of the Tower of London, was sentenced to death for her crimes. Her trial was already predetermined, as the other men before her had been sentenced to death, so it was clear what her fate would be. Cromwell manipulated those men who heard the charges into ensuring Anne was proven guilty. But still at this point she would never have believed that she would be executed a short distance from the King's Hall where she was condemned to death. It would have seemed impossible for Henry to order his wife's execution, but Cromwell's case against her had evidence in abundance, and also testimony against the Queen. The former lawyer had brought down his more prized defendant, the Queen of England. It was this false case that led to Anne's execution inside the walls of the Tower of London, and nothing else. Anne is considered a victim today, and she was not guilty of what she was said to have done. On the 19th of May, 1536, inside the walls of the Tower of London, the Constable of the Tower, William Kingston, wrote that, "This morning she sent for me, that I might be with her at such time as she received the good Lord, to the intent I should hear her speak as touching her innocency, always to be clear." He later went on to say, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." And then she put her hands about it, laughing heartily. "I've seen many men and also women executed, and that they have been in great sorry. And to my knowledge this lady has much joy in death." Before dawn on the 19th of May, she had called the constable to hear mass with her, and she prayed she had never been unfaithful to the king. She was given the sacrament, and she was then told to ready herself, as the executioner was waiting. But Anne Boleyn left the royal apartments, and she was surrounded by 4 ladies who attended on her, and they followed the Constable of the Tower as he led the procession of the dead to the scaffold, which had been built on the north side of the White Tower. Today this would be where the Waterloo barracks are, and where the crown jewels are held, but Anne was known to have been rather positively looking, and she was said to have walked confidently to her death whilst hundreds of witnesses were watching. The doors to the tower had allegedly been left ajar, and some managed to sneak in to look. Anne then made a speech to the crowd and said, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. He was ever a good, a gentle, and a sovereign lord. This I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." Grown men wept as they heard her talk, and she also thanked her women for their service. But then the executioner was given a sack of coins as payment for carrying out a quick job, and a job on her neck that would not be botched. This was almost seen as a bribe. One of her ladies then placed a blindfold over her eyes, and she knelt on her knees and said a final prayer. Her final words were, "O Christ, receive my spirit." And then the executioner unleashed his sword from behind a bale of straw, and the crowd gasped. The executioner's assistant made a noise, and Anne looked that way, and she did not see her executioner coming, and within seconds, from the other direction, her executioner swung the sword and struck Anne Boleyn's head clean off. Following the blade crashing on her neck, Anne's heart would have beaten 1 or 2 more times, and the blood from her ruptured arteries would have poured out onto the scaffold. It was a very quick end, but then in the reign of Queen Victoria in the 19th century, the body of Anne Boleyn would be discovered under the floor of the chapel, but then a royal doctor, Dr. Frederick Mowat, would perform an investigation on Anne Boleyn's remains. Centuries after her death, he wrote that the remains of the executed queen, he documented that they belonged to a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull, bearing witness to the queen's little neck. He then stated, "The bones found are certainly those of a female in the prime of her life, all perfectly consolidated and symmetrical, and belong to the same person. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull, with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and a rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hands and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet, with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. Dr. Mowat stated that the woman in this grave would have been around 5 foot to 5'3" tall in her life, and he confirmed that the head was severed from the body of this woman. This obviously narrowed down the true identity, as there were only a few women who were beheaded on Tower Hill or inside of the tower, including Margaret Pole, Catherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey. He also stated that the neck of the woman was small, which Anne Boleyn was noted for, and he confirmed without a doubt that the remains he had analysed were of Anne Boleyn. The post-mortem of Anne Boleyn confirmed that she had died via decapitation using a very sharp weapon. It also confirmed a number of stories that the Queen had a little neck. However, what it is meant is that the method of execution was quick and as harrowing as the stories which had been told for centuries later. Anne Boleyn was a woman who did not deserve this treatment. Catherine Howard married King Henry VIII on the 28th of July 1540. She was roughly 15 to 17 years old when she married the 49-year-old, large, grotesque and unpredictable Tudor monarch. Catherine Howard's early life has been shrouded in controversy, especially with her relations with a number of men who most probably took advantage of the young girl. It was her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who had found her a place at court, and she quickly caught the attention of many men, including the king. She also attracted the attention of Thomas Copepper, one of the king's courtiers, and Henry found Catherine was very attractive, and they did in public flirt. It was following the clearing up of the mess with Henry's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, that Catherine Howard and the king would marry. Henry had expressed interest in her for some time, and the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, sought to move in and sweep further power by marrying his niece to the king. He wanted to be as powerful as the Boleyn family once were, but the king's interest in Catherine Howard grew massively, and her youthful looks and personality captivated the middle-aged Henry, who wanted a younger woman, and he claimed that he'd never known the like to any woman about Catherine, and he would shower her in gifts and land. Henry described her as the very jewel of womanhood. Catherine was not fit to become a queen consort and someone who would provide counsel to Henry VIII, as she was too young and she was naive, and she would actually never be coronated as a queen. She received a gun salute as a queen, and she must have enjoyed playing queen, as she was given lavish clothes covered in jewels, and in the August of 1540, she left London whilst the court went on progress to escape the plague in the capital. But Catherine was the opposite of her husband. He experienced very bad moods and was enraged a lot, being driven mad by the pain in his ulcerous legs. She was young and carefree, and she was involved in a liaison, or at least an emotional affair, with the king's favourite male courtier, the aforementioned Thomas Copepper. It was said that Copepper had succeeded the king in the queen's affections. The pair met in secret, and these liaisons were organised by Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, and when rumours about the affair emerged, investigations took place, and the Archbishop of Canterbury found compelling evidence, including a love letter written by the Queen to Copepper. In this she professed her love to him. But on the 1st of November 1541, the king, whilst praying in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, was told of his wife's indiscretions, and with this, Catherine Howard's downfall came. She was locked in her room, and it was said of her that, "I found her in such lamentation and heaviness as I never saw no creature, so it would have pitied any man's heart to have looked upon her. She was completely distraught, and there was a fear that she would take her own life." Things moved rather quickly, and on the 23rd of November 1541, Catherine Howard was stripped of her title as queen, and she was imprisoned inside of a convent. She would never see her husband the king again, but the marriage was actually never formally annulled.
Thomas Copepper, and another man, Francis Derham, who had allegedly had physical relations with Catherine before her marriage, were quickly tried and condemned. Copepper was beheaded by axe, and Derham was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Their heads were placed upon London Bridge, and as Catherine Howard was taken to the Tower of London, as her imprisonment became more severe, she allegedly passed under the heads of her former lovers, causing the former queen a breakdown. An act of attainder was passed against her, meaning no trial was needed for her to be executed, and her execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. on the 13th of February 1542, as she had been condemned as a traitor. Her execution arrangements were overseen by Sir John Cage, the Constable of the Tower, and the night before her execution, Catherine spent many hours pretending to lay her head upon the block so that she could practice the best way of placing it, to allow the executioner to strike her head off quickly and in one swift blow. It's claimed that on the morning of her execution that Catherine was laid back and calm, and that she went to her execution with grace. She believed her punishment was worthy and just, and she asked the witnesses inside the tower, close to Tower Green, to pray for her. The executioner was using an axe for this execution, unlike the man who took Anne Boleyn's head, who used a sword. The axe was considered the rougher and less reliable weapon. Things were more likely to go wrong, but this did not happen this time, as the skilled executioner crashed the axe upon Catherine Howard's neck with such poise and power that the fifth wife of Henry VIII's head was struck off in one blow. After this, her head was taken into the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the Tower of London's little church where previously Anne Boleyn had also been buried. Catherine's body was not placed inside of a coffin. It was just collected in a shroud, a rather thin piece of material, and it was then buried in, allegedly, a roughly dug grave inside the Tower of London's chapel. There is a memorial stone that sits close to the altar today, dedicated to Catherine Howard, and containing her coat of arms, but the reality of this is that there is no evidence that Catherine's remains and body have ever been found, and this is due to the behaviour of the men who buried Catherine upon the king's orders. Henry VIII had instructed that Catherine Howard's remains should be buried covered in a thick layer of quicklime, or lime. This material was used to make her remains and body decompose quicker and rot quickly, leading to them being dissolved off of the face of the earth. Using quicklime was done commonly over the years as a method of making people's remains quickly decompose, especially those who were plague victims. The reason Henry VIII ordered this to be used may have been down to the shame and the regret that he had with marrying Catherine Howard, and he also may have felt embarrassed by the fact he had been cuckolded or usurped in his wife's affections by one of his closest friends. The use of quicklime is mostly considered definitive with Catherine's body. Also, in the 19th century during Queen Victoria's reign, work was done inside the chapel to the floor, and the remains of many people who were executed inside of the tower and also on Tower Hill were found. The remains and corpse of Anne Boleyn were found, and it was confirmed that she had lost her head by a blow of a sharp weapon. However, there was an intense search for Catherine Howard's remains, and the archaeologists looked for the teenage queen. There was nothing found. The remains of Jane Boleyn were discovered inside the chapel, and she was executed immediately after Catherine Howard, but nothing could be found for Catherine. This leads to the conclusion that the instructions to use quicklime were carried out upon the remains of the former queen. But there is also another problem. As Catherine Howard was so young when she was executed and then buried, and the quicklime dumped on her remains before the earth, then as her bones had not fully hardened, this could have meant that they rotted quicker and decomposed quicker. So, inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, there are the remains of many of the executed people of the Tower of London and Tower Hill, including Anne Boleyn, Margaret Pole, Thomas Cromwell and Sir Thomas More, but Catherine Howard's remains have never been found. most probably due to the quicklime thrown on her, but Henry VIII did achieve his goal of dissolving Catherine off the face of the earth, putting his fifth marriage behind him, and also preventing her remains from ever being found. Lady Jane Grey was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, and she had royal blood through his youngest daughter Mary, and she was also a great-niece of the infamous six-wifed King Henry VIII. She was a cousin to Edward VI, Mary I and Elizabeth I, and Jane was in line to the throne of England following her cousins, but she was bumped up the list by her cousin Edward VI, who did not want his half-sisters Mary or Elizabeth taking the throne. Following Edward's death, Lady Jane Grey was brought to London, and specifically the Tower of London, and she was proclaimed the Queen on the 10th of July 1553, and she was inside the Tower awaiting her coronation. She had previously married Guildford Dudley, the son of the powerful Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, a man obsessed with power. Whilst Jane was awaiting her coronation, she signed a number of letters with Jane the Queen, and this was then later used against her as evidence that she had therefore accepted the role of Queen. But there was an uprising beginning as Princess Mary, the future Mary I, would build up an army, and quickly the Privy Council, fearing their lives, abandoned Jane and supported Mary, meaning that Jane was now on her own. Mary succeeded to the throne and was proclaimed the rightful queen, and with this, Lady Jane now became a prisoner inside of the Tower. She was imprisoned inside of the gentleman's jailer's apartments, and her husband Guildford was locked up inside the bell tower. Lady Jane was then accused of high treason and was charged with this and stood trial at the Guildhall in the City of London. The trial went as expected, and she was found guilty and was then sentenced to death. Jane was someone who Mary knew very well, and they had mixed in royal circles for many years as younger children and women, but the trial stated that Jane's punishment was to be burned alive on Tower Hill or beheaded as the Queen pleases. So the life of Jane was to be ended and decided upon by the Queen. Some reported that Jane had actually been spared and that Mary took pity upon her, and this would explain the delay with Jane's execution. Mary I thought correctly that Jane and her husband were pawns in the manipulations of other men, and in particular the Duke of Northumberland, who was beheaded on Tower Hill, but following another rebellion breaking out in January of 1554, Mary was convinced to execute Lady Jane. Jane's father had been part of the rebellion, but it did trouble her to let her cousin die, and she was advised by the Privy Council to execute her. With this, it's interesting, as we know that the woman who would later be known as Bloody Mary wanted to spare her cousin and not execute her, and she had reservations around this. Jane was to lose her head, and the execution was first scheduled for the 9th of February 1554, but was then postponed for 3 days to allow Jane to convert to the Catholic faith. Jane did not want to do this. However, on the day before her execution, Guildford asked to meet with Jane, but she refused as she knew it would increase their misery and pain, and it was better to put it off, as they would meet shortly elsewhere and live bound by indissoluble ties. Then, on the morning of the 12th of February 1554, Guildford Dudley, Jane's husband, was taken from his rooms up to Tower Hill, a short walk north of the tower's walls, to be executed by beheading. Shortly later, Jane, standing looking out at one of the windows, noticed her husband's headless corpse and his head being brought back on via horse and cart into the tower for burial. She screamed his name, but it was then her turn. Lady Jane was walked out to the execution scaffold, which stood on the north side of the White Tower, the central fortress within the tower's walls. She was helped up onto it, and there were a few witnesses gathered to see the proceedings. She gave a short speech saying, "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned to the same. The fact, indeed, against the Queen's Highness was unlawful, and the consented thereunto by me, by touching the procurement and desire thereof by me or on my behalf, I do wash my hands thereof in innocency, before God and the face of you, good Christian people, this day. She did not admit to any crimes specifically, but did say, I do wash my hands thereof in innocence, and she recited a psalm, and then passed over her gloves and handkerchief to a maid. Stood also on the scaffold was an executioner, who was armed with an axe, and Jane asked him, I pray you dispatch me quickly. And she asked, will you take my head off before I lay down? The executioner replied with, no, madam. She was blindfolded by herself, and Jane then, who had previously gone to her execution with calm and grace, began to panic. She could not find the block to rest her head on, and she cried out, what shall I do? Where is it? Before the Deputy Lieutenant of the Tower of London guided her head on the block. Her final words were, Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And the executioner then struck his axe down on the 16 or 17-year-old woman's neck, and in one blow her head was taken off. Lady Jane Grey was then buried inside the Tower of London's chapel. The harrowing element of her execution is the fact that she was so young, just a teenager when she was executed in private within the fortress. She was someone who accepted the role of queen reluctantly, despite the fact she was never coronated, and she should really be remembered as a Tudor queen alongside Mary I and Elizabeth I, as she was in fact a queen.
Robert Devereux grew up in a wealth and money. He was raised on his father's estate at Chartley Castle, and his great-grandmother was actually Mary Boleyn, the sister of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife and the mother of Queen Elizabeth I. This made him the first cousin twice removed of Queen Elizabeth I. His father died in 1576, and Devereux became the new Earl of Essex, and he owned a number of prominent houses. He attended university, and his mother married Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, the long-standing favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, and actually Devereux's godfather. Devereux proved himself alongside his stepfather on campaign in the Netherlands, and he then returned to the royal court and quickly gained the eye and favour of the Queen. He first appeared at court in 1584, and within 3 years he had become a favourite of the Queen. He had a lively mind, as well was he well-spoken, and he was a key player in the court of games and was a showman. He was given the title of the Master of the Horse, and was also given the monopoly on sweet wines following the death of Robert Dudley, and this made Devereux incredibly wealthy. He became a member of the Privy Council later on, but some at court warned him about offending the Queen in attempts to gain power and influence. Devereux, in some regards, underestimated Elizabeth, and he later showed a lack of respect towards her, and offended some of her closer advisers, such as Robert Cecil. In fact, during one occasion, Elizabeth I even struck Devereux around the head, and he half drew his sword to her, pulling a weapon upon the Queen. He was involved in Francis Drake's English Armada, but the Queen had ordered Devereux to not get involved. He was later involved in the capture of Cadiz in 1596 and was greatly celebrated as a British explorer and soldier, and he was the second in command to Walter Raleigh. But Devereux continued to defy the Queen's orders, but his biggest failure came in Ireland. He was made the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, talking himself into the job, and at the time the 9-year war was ongoing and no English commander had managed to press home an advantage. Essex led the largest force ever sent to Ireland, around 16,000 soldiers, to end the rebellion, and he also left a hero but came back a villain. He said he would confront the rebel leaders, but he wasted money and resources, and the Irish managed to defeat him on 2 occasions, causing a huge amount of embarrassment. He even allegedly entered a truce with the rebels, which the Queen regarded as a humiliation and a stain on the English crown. He was wanted back home, and he sailed from Ireland in the September of 1599. But the Queen had banned his return to court, and he actually marched into her bedchamber one morning when she did not have her wig on and she was not dressed. His disobedience continued. But the Queen ordered him to be confined to his rooms and that an unruly beast must be stopped. Essex was brought to trial, and it did not take too long before charges were drawn up against him. He was held under house arrest at York House, and he may have communicated with the Scottish king, James VI at the time, to possibly help the Scottish king seize the English throne. At trial, he was deprived of public office, and he remained under house arrest. But months later he was freed and became more desperate, and with this he began in 1601 to fortify Essex House, his mansion on the Strand, and he amassed followers. On the morning of the 8th of February 1601, Devereux and his party of followers, including gentlemen and nobles, entered the city of London, and they tried to force an audience with the Queen. He was immediately declared a traitor, and Devereux tried to storm through a barrier at Leagate Hill, but his men were pushed back, and Devereux scurried back off to Essex House, and then later surrendered to the Queen's forces, who besieged his house. On the 19th of February, Essex, who was tried in front of his peers for treason, said that the indictment charged Essex with conspiring and imagining at London to depose and slay the Queen and to subvert the government. It also stated that Essex had endeavoured to raise himself to the crown of England and usurp the royal dignity, and that in order to fulfil these intentions he and others rose and assembled themselves in open rebellion, and moved and persuaded many of the citizens of London to join them in their treason, and endeavoured to get the city of London into their possession and power, and wounded and killed many of the Queen's subjects then and there assembled for the purpose of quelling such rebellion. Essex was charged also with holding the Lord Keeper and other privy councillors in custody for 4 hours and more. There were many charges which were put to him, but he was found guilty and was sent to the Tower of London to await his execution. Devereux was actually allowed a private execution because of his status and links to royalty, his aunt being the mother of the Queen, and also due to his links to the royal household for years. He was actually the final person to be executed by axe inside of the Tower of London on Tower Green. On the 25th of February 1601, he was led out to greet the executioner, who was stood on the scaffold, and the wooden block was placed there too. It's believed that the executioner was a man named Thomas Derrick, who had even took part in Devereux's escapades in Spain. He throughout his life executed more than 3,000 people, and Devereux was able to select his own method of execution, opting for the axe. Devereux climbed the steps of the scaffold, and he had been allowed a private execution and did not have to suffer the fate in front of thousands on Tower Hill, just a collection of witnesses. He then lay his head on the block after a short speech, and the executioner crashed down his weapon with 3 strikes of the axe. Things didn't go well, and his head was not taken off in one swift blow. Things got very bloody. The execution of Robert Devereux showed that the Queen, even in her final years, was still ruthless to sanction the executions of her former favourites, and of those who were once close to her. Devereux was at one point believed to be a possible husband of Elizabeth, but he was power-obsessed and hungry, and would even raise rebellion to try and regain his position in the court of Queen Elizabeth. But inside of Tower of London, he became the final person to lose his head by axe. One of the biggest problems of the Tudor period was if someone had any trace of royal blood. At the time, this would give someone a claim to the throne, and they would then be seen in the eyes of the king or queen as a threat to their rule. Margaret Pole had royal blood. She was the daughter of George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, and her father was the brother of Edward IV and King Richard III. Her father would also be executed inside the Tower of London's walls as he plotted against his brother Edward IV, Margaret's uncle, and he would be drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine inside one of the Tower's dungeons.
this execution method being used solely in England on this one occasion. Margaret Pole in 1499 also saw her brother being executed, and his lands were taken and were confiscated. The family did suffer during the Tudor period. Henry VII, the Tudor king and enemy of the Yorkist dynasty and family of which Margaret Pole belonged to, meddled in her affairs. Henry VII married Margaret off to his favourite cousin and loyal servant Richard Pole, who was 11 years older. The king and queen attended the marriage ceremony, and it's believed that Henry VII ordered the marriage as her husband was insignificant, and the marriage would then reduce Margaret's claim to the throne and make her less of a danger. But her husband gained a significant amount of land and power under Henry VII's reign, and he was made a Knight of the Garter. But Richard Pole died in 1505, and Margaret was left a widow with 5 young children. She had to borrow money to pay for her husband's funeral, and she then entered Sion Abbey to live on the banks of the River Thames. But her third son, Reginald Pole, devoted himself to the church, and he rose throughout different organisations to later become a cardinal in the Catholic Church. But when Henry VIII came onto the throne, Margaret Pole's fortunes changed, and she was appointed as a lady-in-waiting to the king's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She was present at her coronation, and her son Henry was given a place inside of the king's household. The king then gave Margaret a payment of £100 a year, and the earldom of Salisbury was given and restored to her, this being her brother's former lands. She paid a figure of today roughly £2.5 million for her lands, and it was clear that Margaret Pole was becoming a royal favourite. She had castles built and administered her estates well, and she became the 5th richest peer in England, and was most certainly one of the most well-off women in England. In 1520, Margaret was also appointed the lady governess to Henry VIII's daughter Mary, and she was also her godmother. She was later sacked after her sons had been involved in treasonous affairs with the Duke of Buckingham, but it was later restored to her. She acted as a second mother to Mary, and she was very well respected. But Mary would be made illegitimate and barred from the line of succession following the marriage of Henry to his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Henry insisted that Margaret Pole treat Mary roughly, but she refused to do so, and she even refused to pass the jewels Henry had given Mary back to the king. It was said by the king's chief adviser, Thomas Cromwell, that in no ways she will as yet deliver to Mistress Frances the jewels for anything that I can say or do, unless that it may please you to obtain the king's letters unto her in that behalf. Margaret Pole was a very strong woman, and she also opposed the king's divorce of Catherine of Aragon. Henry VIII turned against Margaret, and he labelled her a fool, but she later was forced to accept the king's annulment and divorce, and also accept the king's supremacy over the church. But Margaret's son, Reginald Pole, warned of many risks if the king divorced Catherine and took control of the church in England. He turned his back on the king and then began to plot against him. Margaret's son, writing ruthless things about Henry VIII, labelling him a robber and murderer. Reginald Pole, who was in Europe, was also asking princes and kings of Europe to invade England to depose Henry VIII. Henry VIII heard about this, and then he summoned Margaret Pole in an attempt to get her son to back down. Margaret briefly returned to court following Anne Boleyn's execution, but in 1537 Reginald Pole was made a cardinal by the Catholic Church. He was then put in charge of organising papal help for the Pilgrimage of Grace, the huge and serious rebellion and uprising in the north of England that saw rebels storm the city of York. Reginald Pole's work in this was well known, and Henry VIII's government even tried to assassinate him, but this treason saw many of the Pole family arrested. Margaret Pole was accused of helping her son, and she was said to have committed and perpetrated diverse and sundry other detestable and abominable treasons. She was interrogated for 3 days by William Fitzwilliam, the Earl of Southampton, and Thomas Thirlby, the Bishop of Ely, and she was held under lock and key. Her interrogators reported back to Thomas Cromwell that, "We assure your lordship we have dealt with such a one as men have not dealt with all before us. We may call her rather strong and constant man than a woman. For in all behaviour, howsoever we have used her, she hath showed herself so earnest, vehement, and precise that more could not be." Margaret continued to deny that she was a traitor, and she said that either her sons have not made her privy or participant of the bottom and pit of their stomachs, or else she is the most arrant traitor that ever lived. In the May of 1539, Margaret Pole was attainted, with the king's passing an act of attainder accusing her of treason, meaning that she was now sentenced to death upon the king's wishes and orders. False evidence was gathered against her, and she was locked up inside the Tower of London. At this point in her life, Margaret Pole was well into her 60s, and she was staying in the cold and dark prison cells in the Tower, and she was kept in rough conditions. The king left her to rot inside the Tower for 2.5 years. Henry did later pay for women to serve Margaret Pole, but she scrawled a poem on the wall of her prison cell. This said, "For traitors on the block should die, I am no traitor, no, not I. My faithfulness stands fast, and so towards the block I shall not go, nor make one step, as you shall see. Christ, in thy mercy, save thou me." It was, then, on the morning of the 27th of May, 1541, that Margaret Pole was told she was to be executed within the hour. She pleaded that she had not been accused of any crime, but the execution was very rough. There had been a low wooden block thrown on the floor of the Tower of London's pavement, and there was a young executioner armed with his axe summoned to perform the job. The axe was known for being a less reliable weapon to take the head of people in London, and there were accounts of many swings of the axe needed. Margaret came across to the block, and she continued to plead and scream, and there had been a few people gathered to witness the execution of the Countess of Salisbury. It was recorded about her execution that, at first, when the sentence of death was made known to her, she found the thing very strange, not knowing of what crime she was accused, nor how she had been sentenced, because the chief executioner had been sent north to deal with rebels. The executioner was performed by a wretched and blundering youth who hacked her head and shoulders to pieces in the most pitiful manner. Blow after blow from the axe crashed down upon the neck of Margaret Pole. She put up a fight on the block, and it allegedly took 11 strikes of the axe to remove her head from her shoulders. The first blow completely missed, and the weapon cut into her shoulders, and Margaret may have even broken free of the block from this. There were later stories of her created that she was running around the Tower of London to try and escape the executioner, who then had to wrestle her to the ground. But Henry VIII had ruthlessly done what he wanted, executed a woman whose son was one of his most intense enemies, and taken the head of a 67-year-old woman, who for him was a threat because of the royal blood that she had and the links to the House of York, the enemies of the Tudor family. 2 of her uncles were kings of England, and one of them would be slain by the forces of Henry VIII's father. It's clear to see why Henry wanted to rid of Margaret, and the actions of her son Reginald by plotting uprising against the king helped to secure her fate and the hands of the butchering executioner inside the walls of the Tower of London. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.